I remember the water that night. Black as ink, warm as blood, and full of lies. August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin. I'd been watching this particular stretch of ocean for longer than most would believe. Salt spray has a way of preserving memories, and mine were already centuries old by the time the USS Maddox cut through those waters like a knife through silk. I was there, naturally. Where else would I be when history decides to fold in on itself? The thing about being in the middle of the ocean at night is that your eyes play tricks on you, or maybe they show you the truth. After all these years, I'm still not sure which is worse. I was perched on a cargo ship's mast that night, invisible as always, watching the destroyer move through the darkness. The crew was nervous. You could smell it on them, even from my distance. That particular cocktail of sweat, cigarette smoke, and barely controlled fear that young men wear like cologne when they're far from home. I'd seen this before, of course. Different ships, different seas, but always the same story. Men with guns, looking for ghosts in the water. Sometimes they find them, sometimes they create them. The Maddox was on what they called a DeSoto patrol, such a mundane name for something that would reshape the world. Intelligence gathering, they said, just listening to radio signals, watching the North Vietnamese coast. Harmless as a Sunday drive if you ignored the fact that South Vietnamese commandos had been raiding those same coasts just days before. Oh yes, I'd watched those raids too. O-Plan 34A, they called it. The Americans pretended they had nothing to do with it. But I'd seen the advisors, heard the English whispers mixed with Vietnamese in the darkness. Captain Herrick was in command of the Maddox. I'd observed him for days, a man caught between duty and doubt. He had the look of someone who'd been told he was playing chess, but suspected the board might explode. Smart man. He knew these waters were already poisoned with suspicion and old anger. The first incident, and I call it that because history insists on numbering these things, as if tragedy comes in sequence, happened on August 2nd. I was below deck on a fishing vessel when it began, close enough to see everything unfold. 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats, Russian-built P-4s, came screaming out of the afternoon haze. They moved like angry wasps, all engine noise and spray. I'd seen those boats before, knew their crews, in a way. Young men who'd been told the foreign destroyer was there to support another commando raid. They weren't entirely wrong. The Maddox had been providing cover for exactly such raids, though they'd stopped just before this patrol. But anger doesn't check calendars, and fear doesn't read operational orders. The engagement was brief. The Maddox opened fire first. Warning shots, they'd claim later, though I was close enough to see the 5-inch shells weren't aimed at empty water. The torpedo boats launched their fish and fired their guns. For a few minutes, the Gulf of Tonkin looked like every other naval battle I'd witnessed over the centuries. Water churned white with wakes, black smoke drifting on the wind, the sharp crack of naval guns echoing across the waves. When it was over, the Maddox had a single bullet hole to show for it. One bullet. I examined it later, when no one was looking. 14 5mm, lodged in the superstructure like an accusation. The North Vietnamese boats limped home, one heavily damaged. The Americans claimed victory. The North Vietnamese claimed they'd driven off the invader. Both were right in their way. Both were wrong. But it was the second incident that interests me more. August 4th. A night so dark you could lose yourself in it, and many did. I was actually on the Maddox that night. Don't ask how. After centuries, you learn ways to be where you need to be. The ship was joined by another destroyer, the Turner Joy. 2 steel guardians, prowling through waters that seemed thick with threat. The radar operators started seeing things just after dark. Contacts appearing and disappearing like phosphorescent ghosts. The sonar men heard torpedoes in the water, high-speed screws churning toward them. The lookout saw wakes in the darkness, pale lines drawn on black canvas. I stood on the bridge, invisible, watching Captain Herrick pace. His face was a study in contained panic. Orders came to engage. The destroyers opened fire, their guns lighting up the night like a deadly fireworks show. They fired at radar contacts that appeared and vanished. They maneuvered wildly to avoid torpedoes that might have been there, might have been dolphins, might have been nothing but the ocean's own heartbeat. For 4 hours, they fought the darkness itself. I moved through the ship during the battle, watching young sailors feed shells into guns, their faces lit by muzzle flashes. I listened to the sonar operators calling out contacts that made no sense. I stood behind the radar operators as they tracked targets that moved too fast, turned too sharply, disappeared too completely. And I knew what they didn't. They were fighting their own fears made manifest. Oh, there might have been boats out there. The North Vietnamese were certainly capable of sending them. But on that night, in that darkness, with tensions wound tighter than piano wire, every wave became an enemy, every shadow a threat. I'd seen it before. In the Mediterranean when Roman galleys fought phantom pirates. In the North Atlantic when convoy escorts saw U-boats in every swell. The ocean at night is a mirror, and sometimes we attack our own reflection. When dawn came, they found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slicks, no evidence of the great battle they'd fought. Captain Herrick, to his credit, began to doubt almost immediately. His messages back to Washington were careful, full of qualifiers. Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful, he would write. Freak weather effects on radar and overeager sonar men may have accounted for many reports, but Washington wasn't interested in doubt. They wanted certainty, and they wanted it to point in one direction. I was in the communications room when the messages flew back and forth, the higher-ups pressing for confirmation, Herrick growing more uncertain with each passing hour. Other crew members were interviewed. Some were sure they'd been attacked. Others admitted they'd seen nothing but darkness and their own ship's wake. The radar returns, when analyzed, showed patterns more consistent with weather than with boats. But the die was already cast. I'd seen this before too, the moment when truth becomes less important than momentum, when the need to act overwhelms the need to know. President Johnson, and yes, I was in Washington too, don't ask how I manage it, was already meeting with his advisors. I stood in the corner of the cabinet room, watching men in suits decide the fate of millions. McNamara, the defense secretary, was certain, or at least he projected certainty, like a weapon. The military chiefs wanted action. They'd been wanting it for months, maybe years. We were attacked, McNamara said, and in that moment it became true. Not because it had happened, but because he said it had. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was drafted with remarkable speed, almost as if someone had been waiting for an excuse. It gave the president power to use military force in Southeast Asia without declaring war. A blank check, written in invisible ink. I watched the Senate debate it. Wayne Morse of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska, the only two who voted against it. Morse called it a historic mistake. He had no idea how right he was. Or maybe he did. Sometimes humans surprise me with their foresight, even as they're being swept along by currents they can't control. The resolution passed 88-2 in the Senate, 416-0 in the House. Democracy in action. Voting on ghosts. The bombing of North Vietnam began almost immediately. Operation Pierce Arrow, they called it, 64 sorties against torpedo boat bases and oil storage facilities. I watched those too from various vantage points. Young pilots dropping death on targets they'd never seen before, starting a war that had been simmering for years but now had permission to boil. And what of the truth? It came out, of course, in pieces and fragments over the years. Declassified documents revealing doubts that were suppressed, certainties that were manufactured. The NSA would later admit that the August 4th attack probably never happened. Key intelligence had been mishandled, mistranslated, or simply invented, but by then, the war was real. The 58,000 American names that would end up on a black wall in Washington were real. The millions of Vietnamese dead were real. The children born twisted by chemicals dropped from planes were real. The veterans who came home broken in body and mind were real, all of it sprouting from seeds planted in dark water on a night when frightened men shot at shadows. I think about that night often, not because it was unique in the annals of human folly. I've seen too many similar nights for that, but because it was so perfectly representative. The way fear and ambition dance together. The way truth bends under the weight of necessity. The way men in power will always find the excuse they're looking for, even if they have to create it themselves. The Gulf of Tonkin taught me something I should have already known after all my centuries. The most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves in the dark, when we're afraid and far from home. I returned to those waters years later. They looked the same, blue-green in the sunlight, black under clouds. Fishing boats still worked the same routes their fathers had. The war had come and gone, leaving scars on the land but barely a ripple on the ocean's surface. But I could still feel it there somehow, the weight of that night. The moment when nothing became something, when shadows became substance, when fear became policy. I met a Vietnamese fisherman once, years after the war. He was old enough to remember those days. We shared a bottle of rice wine on his boat, watching the sun set over the same waters where the Maddox had fought its phantom battle. The ocean remembers everything, he told me in Vietnamese, not knowing I understood. but it keeps its secrets. I nodded and said nothing. He was right, of course. The ocean does remember. And so do I. The thing about being immortal is that you see patterns, the same stories, told with different actors on different stages. The Gulf of Tonkin wasn't the first time a nation had gone to war over an incident that may or may not have happened. The Maine and Havana Harbor, the Lusitania off the Irish coast, the border clash at Marco Polo Bridge. Each time, the same dance, an incident, real or imagined, that gives permission for what was already desired. And it wouldn't be the last. I've watched this species long enough to know that. But there was something special about Tonkin, something perfectly modern. It was the first time I'd seen technology become complicit in the lie. Radar ghosts and sonar phantoms, machines confirming what frightened minds wanted to believe. In the past, men had to lie to each other face to face. Now they could let their instruments do it for them. I think about the sailors on the Maddox often. Young men, most of them, doing their duty as they understood it. They weren't evil. They weren't trying to start a war. They were just scared, far from home, peering into darkness that seemed full of threats. When their machines told them the threats were real, why wouldn't they believe? And I think about the Vietnamese torpedo boat crews from August 2nd. Also young men, also doing their duty, also scared, defending their coast from what they saw as invasion. They attacked a ship that outgunned them 50-1. Brave or foolish? Both, probably. Most human actions are. The truth about that night, both nights, is simpler and more complex than any official version. Yes, there was an attack on August 2nd. Small boats against a destroyer. David versus Goliath, if David had been forced into the fight. And no, there probably wasn't an attack on August 4th. Just darkness and fear, and machines seeing what wasn't there. But the deeper truth is that it didn't matter. The war was coming anyway. If not Tonkin, then something else. The forces pushing toward conflict were too strong, the momentum too great. The incident was just an excuse, a key to unlock a door that was already straining against its hinges. I've learned over the centuries that humans need these excuses. They can't just say, "We want to fight." They need to say, "We have to fight." They need the moral clarity of victimhood, even if they have to manufacture it. And so they do, again and again. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was repealed in 1971, after years of war had shown its true cost. By then, the damage was done. The precedent was set. A president could wage war without declaring it, could send young men to die on the strength of shadows on a radar screen. I was there for that vote too. Watched senators who had voted yes in 1964 try to explain their change of heart. The ones who were honest admitted they'd been swept up in the moment, had trusted too much, questioned too little. The ones who weren't honest blamed everyone but themselves. Senator Fulbright, who had shepherded the resolution through the Senate, called it the most tragic mistake of his career. He spent his remaining years trying to atone, investigating the war he'd helped authorize, exposing the lies that had started it. But you can't take back a war. You can't resurrect the dead by admitting they died for nothing. I've watched many empires rise and fall, seen countless wars begin with lies and end with regret. But there was something particularly modern about Vietnam, something that started in the Gulf of Tonkin. It was the first war of the information age, where truth could be manufactured in real time, where electronic ghosts could justify real bullets. And it set a pattern that continues. Every time I see a nation's leaders pointing to fuzzy satellite photos or ambiguous intelligence reports, insisting they show what must be acted upon immediately, I think of that night in the Gulf of Tonkin. The night when nothing happened and everything changed. The fisherman was right. The ocean remembers everything. Every shell that fell into its waters, every torpedo that cut through its waves, every young man who died believing he was defending his country from an attack that existed only in the frightened minds of other young men. But the ocean keeps its secrets. It doesn't judge. It just rolls on, wave after wave, carrying ships full of humans who think their conflicts matter to the eternal rhythm of the tides. I've sailed those waters many times since 1964. Sometimes on cargo ships, sometimes on fishing boats, once on a yacht full of tourists who had no idea they were crossing a battlefield. The water is the same. The sky is the same, only the ships change and the flags they fly. And sometimes, on very dark nights, when the radar acts up and the sonar hears things that aren't there, I wonder if the ghosts of August 4th are still out there. Not the ghosts of men. There were no men to leave ghosts that night. but the ghosts of possibilities, of roads not taken, of truths not told. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, they call it now. Such a clean, historical name for such a messy, human moment. It sits in textbooks, explained in paragraphs, reduced to dates and facts. August 2nd, attack. August 4th, possible attack. August 7th, resolution. August 10th, war. But it wasn't clean. It was salt spray and fear sweat, radar screens full of false returns and young men's fingers on triggers. It was messages typed by shaking hands, decisions made by men who couldn't admit uncertainty. It was the moment when the possible became the inevitable, when doubt was sacrificed to momentum. I was there. I saw it all. And I've seen it again, in different forms, in different places. The same story, told with new technology, but old human frailties. The Maddox was eventually scrapped, its steel recycled into who knows what. The Turner Joy became a museum ship in Bremerton, Washington. Tourists walk her decks now, reading plaques about that night when she fought phantoms. Do they understand what really happened? Can anyone who wasn't there? Even I'm not sure, and I was there. Because the truth about that night isn't just about what happened or didn't happen. It's about what we're capable of believing when we're afraid. It's about how easily certainty can be manufactured from doubt. It's about the terrible momentum of history, how it sweeps us along even when we know we're heading for the rocks. The Gulf of Tonkin taught the world a new kind of warfare. Not just the physical kind, with bombs and bullets, but the kind where reality itself becomes a weapon. Where truth is what powerful men say it is. Where ghosts can start wars. I've lived long enough to see many things become obsolete. Swords gave way to guns, horses gave way to tanks. But the ability of humans to deceive themselves, to see threats where none exist, to create the reality they fear, that remains as strong as ever. And so I watch. From my various perches, in my various guises, I watch humanity repeat its patterns. Different oceans, different enemies, different technologies, but always the same story. Always the same willingness to believe what we need to believe, to see what we're afraid of seeing. The Gulf of Tonkin is quiet now. The war it started is history. The men who fought phantoms that night are old or dead. The nations they served have moved on to new conflicts, new fears, new ghosts to fight in the darkness. But I remember. I remember the sound of those 5-inch guns firing at nothing. I remember the smell of cordite mixing with salt air. I remember Captain Herrick's face in the red light of the bridge, doubt and duty warring behind his eyes. Most of all, I remember the morning after, when the sun revealed an empty ocean. No wreckage, no oil, no evidence of the great battle they thought they'd fought. Just water stretching to the horizon, keeping its secrets. The sailors knew, I think, in that quiet way that people know things they can't admit. They went about their duties, filed their reports, told their stories. But in their eyes, I saw the question, what really happened out there? It's a question that would haunt many of them for years. I've encountered some of them since, in various places at various times. A former radar operator in a bar in San Diego, still trying to explain what he saw in his scope that night. A gunner's mate in a VA hospital, wondering if the targets he fired at were ever really there. They carry that night with them, a weight that no amount of official history can lift. The North Vietnamese, for their part, always insisted there was no attack on August 4th. Their boats were in port, they said. Their commanders gave no such orders. For years, this was dismissed as propaganda, the expected denials of an enemy. But when the archives opened, when the truth began its slow emergence, their version proved more accurate than ours. I spoke once with a North Vietnamese naval officer, years after the war. We met in Haiphong, the port city that had been bombed so heavily in retaliation for an attack that never happened. He was old by then, missing an arm from a later battle, real this time. We watched the Americans shoot at the darkness, he told me, laughing without humor. Our commanders thought it was a trap at first. Surely they wouldn't waste so much ammunition on nothing? But no, they were really frightened of ghosts. He paused, looking out at the harbor where cargo ships now loaded peacefully. Of course, the ghosts became real soon enough. The bombs, the deaths, the war, all real. Sometimes I think that's how history works. We imagine our fears into existence. He wasn't wrong. I've seen it happen countless times. The phantom enemies we create have a way of manifesting, as if the universe responds to our expectations. We prepare for war, and war finds us. We see threats, and threats appear. The Gulf of Tonkin was just one particularly clear example of this ancient human magic, the ability to conjure reality from fear. The technology has gotten better since then. The radar that fooled the Maddox seems primitive now compared to satellites that can read license plates from orbit. But the human element remains the same. We still see what we expect to see, still interpret ambiguity as threat, still shoot first and search for justification later. I was in the Situation Room during the Iraq War, watching men in suits examine satellite photos of trucks that might be mobile weapons labs, that might be weather balloon stations, that might be nothing at all. The echoes of Tonkin were deafening, but no one seemed to hear them. Different ocean, different enemy, same certainty built on shadows. And I'll be there for the next one too, whatever form it takes. Cyber attacks that might be glitches, drones that might be birds, signals that might be noise. The tools change, but the pattern remains. We are a species that goes to war with our own reflections, and we always find a way to make those reflections real. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the danger of having too much history to draw from. Every event connects to every other, an endless web of cause and effect, action and reaction. Let me return to the Gulf of Tonkin, to those waters that I know so well. There's a detail I haven't mentioned yet, something I observed that never made it into any official report. On the night of August 4th, while the Maddox and Turner Joy were fighting their phantom battle, there was another ship nearby, a small fishing vessel, its lights off to avoid attracting attention. On board were a grandfather and his grandson, out for a night catch in waters they'd fished for generations. I was with them, don't ask why. Sometimes, I'm drawn to the periphery of great events, to the ordinary people caught in history's undertow. The old man heard the guns first, the rolling thunder of naval artillery disturbing the peaceful night. He pulled his grandson down, made him lie flat on the deck. They couldn't see the American ships, but they could see the muzzle flashes lighting up the horizon, the star shells bursting overhead. "What are they shooting at, grandfather?" the boy asked. The old man squinted into the darkness, a lifetime of reading the sea in his eyes. He saw no other ships, no torpedoes, nothing but the Americans firing frantically at empty water. "They're shooting at fear," he said finally. "Men with great weapons often do. They stayed low until the firing stopped, then quietly motored away." The boy would grow up to become a fisherman himself, would tell the story of the night the Americans went mad and shot at the sea. His version never made it into any history book, but it might be the truest account of all, because that's what happened, really. Not an attack, not a battle, but a moment of collective madness born of fear and fed by technology, a superpower firing its weapons at phantoms, creating a war from nothing. The consequences rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The immediate retaliation, those 64 sorties I mentioned, dropping bombs on real targets in response to an imaginary attack. Then the escalation, step by step, until 500,000 Americans were fighting in jungles they couldn't understand for reasons that had been forgotten. I walked those jungles too, naturally. Watched young men from Iowa and Alabama trying to fight an enemy that melted into the landscape, that knew every trail and stream. Watched villages burn and children run. Watched the war that started with phantom torpedoes become a real nightmare that would define a generation. The protesters were right when they chanted, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" But they didn't know the half of it. They didn't know it all started with sonar echoes and radar ghosts, with frightened sailors firing at their own fears on a dark night in August. Or maybe they did know, in that instinctive way that people sometimes understand truths they can't articulate. The whole war felt like a phantom battle writ large, America fighting an enemy it couldn't see, for reasons it couldn't explain, firing massive firepower at shadows and wondering why the shadows kept fighting back. I was at the Paris peace talks too, watching diplomats argue about the shape of the negotiating table while people continued to die. Such a human thing, to focus on symbols while reality bleeds. It took them years to admit what everyone already knew, that the war was unwinnable, that it had perhaps been unwinnable from the start, from that night in the Gulf of Tonkin when fear became policy. The last Americans left Saigon in 1975, helicopters lifting off from the embassy roof while desperate allies tried to climb aboard. I was in the crowd below watching an empire retreat. It was not the first such scene I'd witnessed, nor would it be the last, but it had a particular poignancy, this defeat born from a non-event, this tragedy spawned by phantoms. Vietnam is one country now, communist in name but capitalist in practice, another irony in a history full of them. tourists visit the beaches near where the Maddox fought its ghost battle. They swim in waters that once ran red with real blood spilled for imaginary reasons. And the lessons? Oh, there were supposed to be lessons. Never again, they said. No more wars based on unclear provocations. No more blank check resolutions. Congress passed the War Powers Act, trying to chain the dogs of war more tightly. But you can't legislate away human nature. You can't pass laws against seeing threats in the darkness. And so the patterns repeat, with variations. Different seas, different phantoms, same results. I think sometimes about the men who made the decisions that night and in the days that followed. McNamara, who later admitted he was wrong about almost everything. Johnson, who won his election but lost his soul in the jungles of Vietnam. The admirals and generals who were so certain that American firepower could solve any problem, defeat any enemy, even enemies that existed only in the electromagnetic noise of malfunctioning radar. They're all dead now, their certainties buried with them. But their ghosts linger, not in the Gulf of Tonkin, but in every situation room where leaders convince themselves that action is better than doubt, that striking at shadows is preferable to admitting you can't see clearly. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, such a bloodless name for such a bloody consequence. It should be called the Gulf of Tonkin Illusion, or the Gulf of Tonkin Tragedy, or simply the night America shot at nothing and hit everything. But history likes its clean labels, its neat categories: incident, event, turning point, as if the messy human reality can be contained in such words. I know better. I was there. I saw the fear in sailors' eyes, the doubt in a captain's voice, the certainty of distant leaders who weren't on those dark waters. I watched nothing become something, watched phantoms become policy, watched a non-battle spawn, a real war that would consume millions. And I know it will happen again. Different technology, different ocean, different enemy. But the same human frailty, the same ability to create the reality we fear. We are a species haunted by our own imagination, and we have a talent for making our hauntings real. The Gulf of Tonkin taught us that modern warfare could begin with ghosts on a radar screen. Future wars might begin with false patterns in data streams, with AI hallucinations, with quantum uncertainties interpreted as certain threats. The tools evolve, but the tragedy remains the same: our endless capacity to destroy based on shadows and suppositions. I'll be there for those too, watching from my various perches as humanity continues its ancient dance with fear and power. I've given up trying to warn anyone. Who would believe in a mortal ninja anyway? And besides, the warnings are all there in the history books for anyone who cares to read them. The Gulf of Tonkin, August 4th, 1964. The night nothing happened and everything changed. I suppose that's how it happened, or how I remember it anyway. The truth, it's never where you think it is. Until next time, The Witness.